The Syrian war is very straightforward and not at all complicated. The first faction is the Assad regime. This was headed by the al-Assad family who had been ruling with an iron fist since taking power in 1971. These guys got backing from neighboring Hezbollah for being a Shia-aligned government, but that also made them a target for Israel, which has also been fighting Hezbollah on and off within Lebanon. Of course, Hezbollah is funded and trained by Iran, who viewed the Assad regime as an important ally for its efforts to minimize US influence within the region. We then have the Syrian National Army. This was a group formed from the remnants of the previous Free Syrian Army, which was made up of both regular civilians and defectors from the Assad regime. This gets a lot of support from neighboring Turkey, which has long hoped to install a Syrian government aligned with its own interests. We then have the Syrian Democratic Forces, which much like the Syrian National Army were formed in opposition to the Assad regime. This faction is mostly made up of Kurdish groups who fight for an autonomous region within Syria. This often leads them into conflict with the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army, as Turkey fears that autonomous Kurds within Syria could embolden its domestic Kurdish separatist movement. The United States is also involved in the conflict, seeking to act as both a check to extremist groups within the region and because the Assad regime is backed by some of its biggest geopolitical rivals, like Russia and Iran. The United States was allied with Turkey in backing the Free Syrian Army, however it also backs the Syrian Democratic Forces, who fight against both the Free Syrian Army and Turkey itself. Turkey has also enjoyed a loose alliance with Russia, as both nations see pragmatic value in limiting Western influence within the region. Russia itself has long supported the Assad regime, not only to counter Western influence within the Middle East, but because the Assad government let Russia set up a warm water naval base in the Mediterranean, something worth its weight in gold for the Russians. Furthermore, because the Russians were operating in Syria, this also drew Ukraine into the war, which finds itself compelled to weaken Russia's global interests. However, just because Ukraine doesn't like the Russians doesn't mean it automatically hates its ally Turkey, because Turkey is also friends with the United States, which in itself doesn't like Russia. Another key player is the Gulf Cooperation Council, made up of Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia and Qatar opposed Assad due to being rivals with Iran, which led them to support Sunni-aligned rebels. The UAE was initially in favor of this kind of anti-Assad support, but later reconsidered because Assad hates jihadist extremists as much as they do. Bahrain and Kuwait mostly just followed the lead of Saudi Arabia, while Oman opted to just kick back and eat some slow-cooked lamb shua. Other European nations like France, the UK, Norway, the Netherlands, and Germany were briefly involved for a time, which was mostly because they started wondering where the hell all these Syrians were coming from. The last main faction is Al-Qaeda, which became gradually more fragmented as the war continued. From the offset, the Al-Qaeda jihadist faction saw a great opportunity to expand its influence within the region. Al-Qaeda already hated the Assad regime for its Shia ideology, and the group saw the perfect opportunity to establish its own Islamic caliphate. As it turns out, pretty much all established nations tend to hate extremist groups, so Al-Qaeda got hands thrown at it from all sides. In 2014, an internal faction called the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, better known as ISIS, split off from Al-Qaeda following ideological and leadership disputes. ISIS preferred a more violent and expansionist strategy, while Al-Qaeda had a slower and more gradual approach. Just in case you missed that, Al-Qaeda, the group that did 9/11, thought ISIS was a bit too extreme. Jabhat al-Nusra was also an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. However, the group eventually rebranded and merged with other groups to distance itself from its origins. Today, the group is called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. If any of this is still confusing, viewers can simply refer to this very simple chart to make sense of it all.